ourselves. My name's Anna Robinson. I'm a psychotherapist and also the mental and emotional health lead here at Birmingham Education Partnership. And I'll ask Anna and Mandy, my colleagues, to introduce themselves as well. So Mandy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi. I was going to say good morning, it still is. Mandy McCrone here. I'm a strategic lead on the New Start programme at BEP, and my background is in secondary education.
That's great.
Hi, I'm Anna Bateman. I'm also a strategic wellbeing lead on the New Start project. My background is primary, but I work in primary and secondary schools.
Brilliant, thank you. And also, I suppose we just wanted to thank our colleagues who we've worked with to refine this presentation. So we do annually a loss and bereavement training anyway for schools, but obviously at the moment it feels slightly more urgent possibly for people. So we pulled together a small reference group just to make sure we'd refined everything for kind of here and now. So that was a group of DSLs that we worked with. Jenny Graham, who's the chief exec of Beyond the Horizon, which is a bereavement charity, and also Lisa Sarbatig, who's an independent education psychologist. So they've worked with us to kind of bring all of this together. So hopefully it works for what you need right now. So what we'll talk about today is an offer of some guidance, some considerations for yourselves, for your school community. And you don't have to do everything that's in here, but I think what we know schools have found helpful is the kind of guided thinking that some of the resources we'll send out afterwards and that we'll talk through give you. And as I say, we understand the need at the moment in particular. And also looking after yourself is really important. So grief is a really emotive subject for all of us. And as Anna will talk about a little bit later on, you know, sometimes those feelings around it pop up often at the most unexpected times. So, you know, do use this hour and a half to just, you know, absorb information, listen to what you need to, but if you do need to go out, take a break and things, that's absolutely fine. And the resources that we reference at the end, I think it's always important to bear in mind that they are as relevant for us as professionals, as leaders, as they are for the people who we serve. And often we feel like we need to be invincible when we're in that kind of leadership management role. But they are as relevant for you. So things like the cruise helpline and things are as relevant for staff as they are for pupils and for parents. As I said, and anybody who's just joined us, we'll mute everybody. It's not personal. It's just so that the sound quality is a little bit better. And also feel free to turn your camera off as well. So, you know, if you are still managing to be at home in any way at all and you are embracing the lycra as I am these days after the obligatory lockdown stone has been put on, then, you know, we're all amongst friends here and that's fine. We won't take questions as we go through today, just because we want to make sure we cover all the material, but we've normally found, haven't we, we've finished a little bit early. So if you want to hold on to questions or make any notes in the chat as we go through, and then where we've got time at the end, we'll go through those. And what we've said is where we've not been able to, we'll make sure we kind of pull together some kind of written response for anything we can't manage to cover. Or you will get all of the resources, you'll get all of the slides. And I also just wanted to accept or to raise really with you about accepting difference, because when we're in this kind of online world, what we don't get to do is do the same kind of dialogue that we might normally do. So what I want to kind of name with you is about, you know, we may well think and feel different things, and that's okay. And if we were all in an environment together, we'd, you know, be able to kind of do some more work with that. But because we are where we are, we're limited in some ways by technology. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. So we're going to think a little bit about what is bereavement and loss, how we process loss at different ages, so some developmental ages and stages. We'll think about social and cultural expectations, and also then about guidance for schools. So how do we know we're prepared? What are helpful and unhelpful things to be thinking or saying for young people? That kind of thing. So we'll take you through all of those. And I guess the place to start really is to say that change and loss happens to us all of the time. So we're always in this process of managing and adapting and responding to change and to loss. So any time that we experience a change, or anytime we make a decision, for that matter, we lose the opportunity to make another decision. So there's always loss that we're processing. But moving house, starting a new school, starting new jobs, leaving jobs, serious illness, any change in family circumstance, redundancy and bereavement, all have the same kind of elements to them. So you'll see in this kind of little picture here of the river of life, the bereavement and the waterfall, that's relevant to any time that we have any experience of loss or change. And we might go through it to different extents. But anybody who's experienced maybe the loss of a job when they weren't perhaps ready, things like that, those feelings are all there, those feelings around grief. And I think it's also important just to remind ourselves that, yes, whilst we're here in quite unprecedented times, actually, this is a reality for many of our pupils and also for us all of the time. It's the only certainty, really, that we will lose people as we go through life. So every 22 minutes, and this is data from 2018, a parent of dependent children dies in the UK, and up to 70% of schools have a bereaved pupil on their roll at any given time. So about 1 in 25 children have experienced the loss of a parent or sibling. So it's there in the fabric of our schools anyway. It exists there, which is why actually it's quite important that we acknowledge that and we do work around it anyway. And 92% of young people will experience a significant bereavement. So that means somebody who's very important to them or something that's very important to them before they're 16 years old. And the other thing, I guess, is that for most of us, most children, young people, most adults, when we have the right help and support, actually we can integrate loss into ourselves, we can ride through it, and we don't require a more specialist or professional input. And what children do really need, and what all of us need, are familiar and trusted people around us. So in school, you are fantastically placed to give all of that support. So to help with all of those kind of day-to-day things, to keep the routines and things going. And even at the moment where children haven't been at school, the contact that you have been able to give remotely is really, really important. And so all staff having an understanding of child development is really important, because regression for children is really, really common. So if any of you have had children who have not been at school throughout lockdown, what you may have noticed is as they have lost the routine, as they've lost the contact with friends and staff in quite the same way, some of their behaviours may have become more regressed. So that's quite normal. So if we think about what grief is, so grief is that kind of really acute pain that goes with loss, and it feels very deep because it's a reflection of something that we've loved. So anything that we love, we can lose. And that feeling of grief can feel really all-encompassing, almost kind of a physical pain. And as I was saying before, it's not just about people, it's about anything that we hold close to us. So anything that's important to us, a job, animals, homes, possessions that are really significant, anything in which we have an emotional investment. And there's not really a formula to grief. It can be quite complicated, and there's no fixed expiration date. I was reading an article the other day that was talking about actually we never really finish grieving. We integrate it into ourselves and we find ways to move around it, but it remains with us as an experience. And some people would believe that grief follows stages, and others that it's a really kind of individual emotion. So not all of us grieve the same way. And we've got a little film later that will say a little bit more about that. And if we think then about theories, and the number of times we've done this, and I've never, as a good therapist should do, shifted Freud to the top of here. So if we think about theories, and if I start with Freud, so Freud wrote a paper on mourning and melancholia, which he wrote around the period of the First World War, and he talked about grief and mourning as two distinct things. So grief is the kind of immediate experience, and then the mourning is what continues afterwards. So if you think of it as kind of there's an earthquake and the land is moved and changed, and although the land still remains, it will never be the same as it was before. So the grief is that kind of initial earthquake, and then the mourning is the aftershocks that keep coming. That means that the landscape is forever changed afterwards, although it still exists. And then you'll also know about kind of John Bowlby's work around attachment. So that stems from his experience as a young boy, where he had a nanny who was very important to him and who he lost. So she was taken away and he'd had a very close relationship with her. And it was from that place of that attachment rupture that he built then his attachment theories from there. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, some of you will also have heard of, and we'll look at her stages of grief a little bit later on. And then there are the more kind of process-driven theories. So where we oscillate between life seeming to carry on as normal and actually being in real kind of despair and grieving. So that kind of oscillation between the two, and we'll have a little look at those. And there are loads of others. So we've just kind of pulled out a few to think about together. So here's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model. What I think is appealing about this, and we'll send you this as a separate slide because then you can see some of the detail within it. And what I think is helpful about this presentation of it is that it really starts to break down for us some of the emotions and the kind of what I would call the affects, so the feelings that go with grief, how we can recognize them, what it is and why it is we're feeling, and what it means for us. And the meaning is quite important, because what people often struggle with is the making meaning out of this experience. So what appeals, I think, as well to people about this particular model is that it feels like it's nice and kind of set, and we move through things. And you might have heard people say themselves, well, I've done anger, I've done denial. And I guess what I would want to say to you is that we can dip in and dip out of all of these different elements. We don't necessarily go through one, tick the box completed and move on. But I think this is a really nice way to kind of articulate what it is, how we notice what some of those feelings might be and why we feel it. So it kind of really normalizes things for us. And then Strobe and Schupp, they talk about this kind of more, as I was saying, this oscillation between managing our everyday lives and going between our grief work, so where we're feeling the loss, it might feel quite intrusive at times, and then the more restoration oriented world, so where we're noticing the changes that happen and we're making things happen, we're doing new things, we're starting to move forward a little bit more, and we go between the two at different times. And for me, this one seems to fit quite well for my experience, but you know, as I would always say, different strokes for different folks. So you know, it's helpful for us to understand that there are lots of different ways to think about how we process grief. And we need to also remember that children grieve very differently from adults. And the reason this is important is because it helps us think about the developmental age that we might be dealing with. So you may have a teenager in front of you, but actually what their experience is something more at the level of a toddler. And that then helps you work out, well, where do I need to pitch my interventions? Where do I need to pitch my tone? Where do I need to pitch my body language? Things like that. So most children don't experience the same sustained intensity of emotions that adults do. So they kind of dip in and dip out. So if I think about when our dog died last year, if you hear a bark, we do have a new dog now. But our daughter, for example, would every so often be absolutely overwhelmed by huge sadness and go and sit in our dog's old basket and cry. And then the next minute, she'd be absolutely fine and had moved on. And it's that dipping in and dipping out that sometimes can be quite hard for us as grown-ups, because you're connecting emotionally with a child and empathizing with them, and suddenly they've moved on from it. And that can be quite difficult for us as adults. And children can also feel what I would call somatic experiences, so physical manifestations of grief. So tummy aches, headaches, things like that. So different kinds of pain. And as they grow older, their grief may change and be experienced in different ways. So our developmental milestones, so particular things that children go through that might be moving to a new school, GCSE results, anything that's a particular kind of marker, 16th birthday, for example, moving into being a teenager, they can trigger past experiences. I sit on the bereavement pathway group for the clinical commissioning group, so for the NHS for Birmingham. And one of the things that organisations are noticing at the moment with some of the helplines that are out there is actually it's not people contacting them around grief and bereavement here and now, but it's people whose previous bereavements have been re-triggered by the here and now. So I suppose it's just kind of reminding people that actually You know, this kind of can be tipped off in as at any time. So if we think about how we might recognise a grieving child, when you look at some of this, if any of you have done any work around attachment and trauma, what you'll notice is that many of these presentations and these experiences that young people would have will match some of what you would see for a child who might have had some attachment challenge or connection challenges. So, for example, mood swings, feeling quiet and withdrawn, unable to concentrate. And of course, when we think about attachment, that is about loss and rupture. So it stands to reason then that we would see similar kinds of behaviours. And then if we start to think about the ages and stages of children, so we think about children who are under 5, for example, they don't have a concept of death as being something permanent. So it's quite difficult for them to relate to the fact that something's never going to come back again, because somehow death seems like it's reversible, and there's a real curiosity about it. So I remember in particular a lot of conversations about a dead squirrel once that we found out on a walk with our daughter, and trying to understand that actually the squirrel was not going to come back and what was going to happen to the squirrel. And children under 5 may well have what we would call magical thinking or some kind of omnipotence. So somehow they may have caused this to happen because they are naturally egocentric. It's why young children struggle with empathy, because they don't have that part of their brain developed yet. And one of the things that we need to do then is remind children that it's nothing they did, nothing that they did that caused someone to die, so it's not their fault. And they may need reassurance that they're actually not that powerful, because that could be quite frightening for children to imagine that they are that powerful, that things happen for a reason, and sometimes we can't necessarily explain them. And so being aware then that using more abstract explanations or some of the euphemisms that people like to use, so somebody's passed on or they've gone on a journey or a long sleep, is not necessarily helpful for young children, because they can't get the metaphor, and that can then create worries about going to bed, going on journeys, not coming back. So actually simple language that explains what's happened, children are able to tolerate quite a lot when as adults we put it to them in a way that's digestible. And normality and routine, again, are really, really important. Just keeping things going as well as we can do for some normality, same people around, things like that, being able to go to the same places. And then when children get to that kind of 6 to 12, that kind of emerging into pre-adolescent phase, they're starting to develop an understanding that death is permanent, so that all life functions end when you die, that it's something that happens, and it can happen to them and to people that they care about as well. So there's a kind of a universality to it. And you might also then have quite inappropriate questions from young people, or what we perceive to be quite inappropriate questions. I don't know whether any of you have ever been to funerals or anything like that, and actually where you've got young children there, sometimes they will gorgeously ask a hugely inappropriate question, normally at a very inappropriate time, and that's quite normal. And that can be, again, hard for us as adults to manage. And children will use play to make sense of what's happened. And you may have seen, if you've been around younger children at the moment, that they will play to process and make sense of the whole of this kind of lockdown experience. So if they play with teddies or dolls and things, actually, they may have them in a bubble. They may be talking to them about what's going on at the moment. That's their way of processing things. And then at this age, so whereas younger children are much more egocentric, at this age they're starting to develop their capacity for empathy. So they may then be able to understand that actually there's an awareness of how other adults might be feeling, other children might be feeling. But that can also then mean that some children who are quite highly sensitive hide their reactions because they don't want to upset other people. So for us then it's about encouraging young people and younger children to express their feelings, to normalise things, to understand that how they feel is normal. It's okay for people to feel upset. It's quite normal for people to feel upset. We can be there for them, you know, kind of encouraging them to be kind. And then when we start to hit the exciting and awkward adolescent years, young people are really starting to question and build their own identity. So they're thinking about who they are, what's important in their lives. And so death then means that they might reflect on some of the meaning and purpose of their lives, and they may want to hide their feelings, or may not want to. And so for us then as adults, our job is letting them know that we're here if they want to talk to us, but also to appreciate that we might not be the person they want to talk to, and that we can find somebody else for them to talk to. So knowing what's out there, what's available, who are trustworthy and kind of solid people for young people to lean on is really important. And the other interesting thing about adolescence, which I find absolutely gorgeous, is that it's a time when young people desperately want to feel or to be different from everybody else, but they also really want to be the same. So they want to be the same as their friends, but they also want to be different. So I'm going to dress in this particular way because I want to be different, but I'm going to dress exactly the same as my group of friends here. And so when children of that age lose somebody who's important to them, it can make them feel very, very different at a time when actually they want to be the same as their close group of friends. And relationships with others become increasingly important. So any kind of feelings of loss might display themselves as anger or quite severe distress. So from about the age of 9, children start to turn towards their peers much more than their parents as a source of guidance and support. So just kind of bear some of those things in mind when you're thinking about where young people might be getting support from, and what that means for how we educate all young people about managing and experiencing loss. So adolescents also have quite an adult understanding of bereavement and of loss, but they don't have the coping skills that we as adults might have because they haven't had the life experience to be able to do that. So young people might act out and show impulsive or reckless behaviour. So they might fight, there might be substance misuse. There can be a really wide range of emotions, but young people won't necessarily know how to handle them or feel comfortable expressing them. And the other thing that happens for adolescents is because adolescence is about feeling quite invincible, which is why we see often an increase in risk-taking behaviour. And the reality of death then comes into conflict with some of that feeling. And issues around wanting to be independent and to separate from family can make that quite hard for families who really want to be there for their young people, and carers who want to be there for their young people and give them support. But actually that young person is saying, but I want to go out with my friends, I want to get my support somewhere else. And so that can cause tension within families about where a young people seeks their support. And then as adults, some of the other things that we might experience, and that kind of moving through adolescence, people will start to experience potentially, are things like low motivation, find it difficult to problem solve, and that's partly because the ways our brains are working means that the bit where we can do our thinking, so our kind of wise owl brain has gone offline sometimes. We might fear being on our own. We might turn to substances to be able to self-medicate. Our immune system can become quite vulnerable, and that's to do with how stress and cortisol levels play out in our systems. We might experience some denial. We might find it difficult to be consoled, and we might be quite irritable, mood swings, difficulty sleeping, and changes in our eating patterns. And again, if you think about some of the things that you might have experienced over the last 12 weeks or so, you might notice some of those things have been happening for you as we've had a loss of our lives as they might usually be. And I guess the other thing to just mention is we tend to think now much more systemically. So we think about the way that all of these different layers of the system interact with each other. So we've got here the child at the centre, but we've got their immediate environment, so their family, their school and things around them, and the way that society is, all impact on how young people experience loss. And if you think about social media and things now, and if we think about when Caroline Flack took her own life, actually the impact on that on young people was quite huge, because they felt they knew her in a different way from perhaps a few years ago when social media wasn't quite as prevalent and things weren't out there as much. So young people now, and ourselves as well, I guess since sort of Princess Diana really, we've experienced loss in a much more social way, and it's been much more acceptable to do that than it was historically. And if we just think about faith and bereavement, and one of our colleagues who leads a piece of work working specifically with South Asian communities, would kind of be at pains to say we need to acknowledge some of the differences here, and we need to think about faith and bereavement and questions of faith. Excuse me. Some of the things that might emerge might be around anger at a higher power, questioning about why me, why now, meanings of life, those kind of real existential questions about meaning and about our place in the universe. And it can change our values and make us question what's important, and also can be a huge source of support for young people and for families. And so our role as adults then is about not necessarily knowing or fully understanding customs and values of other faiths, but being willing to acknowledge that we don't know and ask for help to understand some of those things. Find out some of what the rituals and customs might be. Understand and think through how distress and upset might be displayed differently and might not always be visible, and try and kind of become okay with that for ourselves, because it's different from what we might do. And as you all would do, respecting a child's beliefs, whatever they are, and whatever they are in comparison to our own, because our own can only add confusion sometimes. And being okay to seek help, support from the appropriate faith professionals, and also, where we need to, being willing to engage with interpretation and translation services so that we know that young people and their families are able to understand and get their needs met and get what they need. So I'm just going to hand over to Anna, who's going to talk with us a little bit more about endings and transition. So Anna, I will mute myself.
Thanks, Anna. So as Anna alluded to earlier, obviously death isn't just, loss isn't just about death. It's about how we transition from one part of our lives to another. It's how we may have lost something previously. And it's how that loss or how that ending has happened that actually creates that sort of level of grief that we might feel. It's why we do the events that we do for year 6 and year 11. We're helping them transition. They're saying goodbye to a part of their lives that they had, and we're moving on. And that's why it's so important to almost sort of really help children and young people to almost lose and move on and transition well through these things. So we can experience loss in all sorts of different parts of our lives, and particularly, as Anna said, a lot of the data that's coming out isn't just about the here and now. It's about how it's triggered previous loss and the experiences that people have had through that loss that actually is affecting how they're feeling right now and their level of grief. So obviously we can experience loss, as Anna said earlier, in sort of relationship breakdowns, that prolonged absence of someone, loss of a home, loss of a teacher, what we call disenfranchised grief. So this is where we can't maybe outwardly show the grief because of all sorts of reasons. So this could be death by suicide because it's stigmatized. It could be that we've, found out that someone that we haven't seen for a long time has died, or even miscarriage, for example. So those are the kind of things where we might not feel that we can actually, that loss can be acknowledged openly. And as I said, not being able to say goodbye, and particularly in these current times, we know that limits are being put on funerals, for example. Families are not able to grieve and sort of say goodbye in the way that they would have chosen to, and that really does affect that feeling of loss and sort of almost adds to it in some way. So we need to consider how we think we help people sort of move through loss, and actually how that loss has been had, or how abrupt that ending has been, can have a big impact on grief moving forward. So we wanted to show you a video clip. It's just a few minutes long, and it's a really lovely video from Dr. Susan Delaney. She explains this a bit more on different grieving styles and how we grieve.
There are different grieving styles. Some people say men and women. I think kind of more broadly it makes sense to say there's more a masculine way and a feminine way of grieving. Most of us are pretty stable across our lives. What I mean by that is we'll grieve in the way we do everything else. So most likely, people that like to talk and connect and to share, they're going to do that in grief. People who are more private, who choose not to share a lot about their feelings, who don't tell the world and put things on Facebook every day. You know, we can usually judge how someone is going to be in bereavement. So a more feminine way of grieving is bringing people in, the conversations, the emotional sharing. Somebody else might have a very different style. And then the dance then is, if we're meeting someone, we have our way. You know, but if we're the supporting person saying, well, I think it'd be good for you to cry, or it'd be good for you to talk, are we so sure about that? We need to meet someone just how they are. There isn't a right and a wrong way of grieving. Just as we were saying, there aren't a set of stages that you go through. People find their own way through grief, and I think one of the most important things we can say, and I include myself in this, be very cautious who you take advice from. You know, there's loads of experts and people tell you what you should do. Again, it's a way of us, I think, having some control. We're very quick with that. I tell you now what you should do. What makes us think that we would know what someone else should do? The stories bereaved people tell of saying, coming home and someone saying, well, I cleaned out the room for you. I knew that would help. We really need to take a step back. That's not meeting somebody where they need to be. I call it sort of the man on the bus. Oh, I wouldn't like the sound of that. No, that doesn't sound right. We do it around going to visit a grave. Oh, they're going every day. No, I don't think that's right. Or he never goes to the grave. No, I don't like that. Well, seriously, how many times are you meant to go to the grave? There isn't rules for these things. But we get caught in it ourselves because it activates our own anxiety of, oh, what would I do if I was them? So if we can pause in that and just, we know this person, we know how they are across their life, we can probably make a good guess of whether there's someone who's going to want to talk or not. But grieving is exhausting. So even somebody who heals through talking and sharing, they're going to need a break from their grief. They also need to start picking up the pieces of their life as they start to move on without that person. And we all need some distraction sometimes. Don't ever underestimate the benefit of somebody who can just make you laugh, even in a funny time. I think the funniest, and in some ways the worst thing, a friend of mine said, when someone died belonging to me, he was saying, oh, I thought they might hold on a few more weeks and then you wouldn't need those tickets. And it was one of those moments you think, oh, this is so on the edge. And he was laughing, but it was funny. I wouldn't be taking those risks too often, but it was the laugh of him saying, well, if he didn't die, then maybe I could have the tickets. It was so outrageous, all you could do was laugh. But that's somebody who judged it just spot on. I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay, so really what we wanted to sort of just share with you with that is just how different grieving can be for different people, and certainly how their personality is, and even to do with you know, whether they sort of grieve in a male or female way, and just, you know, they're actually looking at that and how they then might grieve are very strongly correlated. And I think what was lovely as well, just sort of explaining that, you know, sometimes we want to feel like we want to control the situation by telling someone what to do or how they need to grieve or how many times they should go and visit the grave, for example. And I think, you know, as she said there, it's just about taking that step back and thinking, actually, what do they need? Where are they? And how can I help them along this sort of, you know, to be with them as they grieve in the way that they feel that they need to. So we thought it might be helpful as well, therefore, in the next couple of slides, just to think about things that might be really helpful to say. That's sometimes difficult, isn't it, in the moment, what to say to someone when they are grieving. And then also sometimes what are things that perhaps aren't great to say. And some of these have been pulled together from our Beyond the Horizon colleagues. Thanks, Anna. So things that might be helpful to say, obviously, is just that it's that listening ear and validating. I can understand why you might feel this way. And it's just really validating their feelings, listening to them and taking time to sit and allow them to sort of to share, you know, I'm sure all sorts of things that they, you know, they will want to share with you. Acknowledging their fears. And particularly in these situations for children and young people, they're going to be worried perhaps if someone's passed away, someone's died because of COVID, that actually they're going to be worried that other family members may. And so whilst we can't really always sort of acknowledge, we can't say, well, that won't happen, but what we can do, we can acknowledge and be, you know, factual about the actual sort of the rarity perhaps of a bereavement through COVID, the fact that we know as long as we can wash our hands and keep ourselves safe and wear a mask when we're out, those things will keep us safe as much as possible. So we can only reassure as we can do, honestly. And I think sometimes when we are presented with someone in grief, that we can say things that perhaps, you know, we're not being honest about ourselves. So just being on, you know, acknowledging that. Checking their understanding, and I think this comes back to the slides about children developmentally, where they are in terms of their grief. And just, you know, for some children there's real sort of black and white thinking, there's some, you know, they're thinking very literally, and it's just trying to understand what it is that they mean through the language that they're using, and just checking out their understanding. You know, can you tell me more about that? What do you mean by this? Do you mean this? Or perhaps, you know, some people might say it's like that. So just exploring that and trying to understand. And then where appropriate, sharing your own feelings. And it's okay to let children know that you are also sad and upset about something, and that you're acknowledging that you feel that way too. Thanks, Anna. And things that might be unhelpful to say. So as Anna said earlier, so avoiding the euphemisms that can come. And often those are related to, as Anna said earlier, we might, you know, children might hear the phrase that someone's fallen asleep, they've passed away, they've passed on. And often that's not helpful, and particularly when children, when young people have perhaps never experienced a loss or bereavement before. And so, you know, them trying to make sense of that language is going to be more helpful where we can avoid using those euphemisms, and using the word died. And then saying, I know how you feel. Often we, you know, that's something our sort of default position, isn't it? I know how you feel. It's almost, but actually do we? And if we really just think about Susan's video, do we really know how they feel? Because actually they're processing their grief differently to how we would process our grief. So actually, do we really? And that's where that listening ear comes in, to understand how they feel. He or she's in a better place now. And again, for children, you know, often that's related to where we might think that someone is in heaven, for example. And I think for children, that's very difficult because for them, it's like actually the best place for them to be is with me now, it's here. So actually, if they're in a better place, that sort of doesn't help their understanding. It doesn't really help them process. Everything happens for a reason. Again, you know, it's not a helpful thing to say. It's sort of quite dismissive when somebody's going through that grief. You know, they've lost someone that they're, or something that they're emotionally attached to in a big way. And actually to say that that's happened for a reason is really quite dismissive and not helpful. Saying don't cry, or you need to be strong now. Again, it's not helpful. For some people, they want to cry. That's how they will process how they feel. It'll actually make them feel better when they've had a good cry. Some people, it doesn't, and that's okay. And saying to someone that they need to be strong, actually, you know, the fact that we're grieving is just the fact that we've loved something or someone, and that's a normal part of the process of life, and that's not helpful either. And also, it could be worse. I know this person who, and again, we know that that's sort of, you know, quite dismissive, where because it's just basically started you off on a journey of talking about someone else rather than actually sitting and listening and validating them. And sometimes we can also talk about the fact that, you know, someone's had a long life, or well, at least they've lived a long life. And again, that's not always helpful. Whilst that might be true, it's not really helpful for the person who has now just lost that person who's had a long life. And it's almost, and I know I've said it myself, and you realise actually it's quite dismissive. Well, yes, that's true, but actually I'm really sad about it, and I'm you know, actually really devastated. And actually sitting again with them in that grief rather than sort of just dismissing, well, yes, they've lived a long life. So hopefully that's helped you with some of the things to say and not to say when we're grieving. School really helps children and young people. It's a great space for them often when there is a bereavement or a loss of some kind, that school can actually provide that normality. So when everything else feels like it's fallen apart, that routine offers security and continuity, and schools are brilliant for that. And actually what's been interesting through this lockdown is when I've spoken to head teachers and leaders, they've said, actually the children that we thought would struggle haven't. And there's children that we didn't even know about are now having difficulty with their mental health. They've started, you know, to get really anxious. And for some, because that normality and they've lost that routine, it's really difficult for them. The opportunity to be a child. So if there is a loss or a bereavement, the school gives them chance to play and laugh and sing and be a child without actually feeling guilt. It gives them that opportunity of sort of almost relief from possibly what's going on at home. So they can feel that kind of level of just, you know, connection and normality to routine and other people that are around them. And the support systems you have in place, you know, the pastoral support is always phenomenal. And they've always got somewhere then they can talk to that perhaps they can't do at home in the same way. And some children feel that they need to perhaps spare their parents' feelings by hiding their grief. And school provides that great outlet for them to be able to share and talk with their friends and staff, of course, as well. What's great as well, so often schools have got a whole range of stories and novels and poems to kind of give young people and children a chance to talk things through. And we're going to talk about a bit more about some really great stories and some things that you can use in school. Obviously, as I've said, the most important thing is that emotional connection, that listening ear. But also we need to be aware that staff need to have a mechanism for being able to take care of themselves, because sometimes when we are being that listening ear for someone else, we need the time to go to someone else and just sort of, you know, literally just offload and be able to talk about. So just making sure that we've got those systems in place to support one another whilst we're helping children, young people, and indeed adults in our school community. Thank you, Anna. So I'm going to hand over to Mandy now, who's going to talk a little bit more about then that process within school. Thanks, Mandy.
Thank you. So yes, as Anna said, we're going to start to look at now what you can do in your school. And one of the things that you can do, I know many of you have got larger numbers of students in school now, but we still haven't got back to our full capacity. And so taking this time to get yourselves prepared is really time well spent. And I would say that having a policy around bereavement will greatly help you. Traditionally, the bereavement policy is probably sat in your critical instance suite, but it allows you to think through the stages, decide what messages your school wants to give out, what sort of support is available, and so on and so forth. And this really resonates with me because I was in a school prior to critical incident policies becoming sort of mandatory, and we had a freak road traffic accident, and it was a Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, and it resulted in the death of one sixth form student, and her friend was in intensive care for literally months. So it's a very shocking accident to occur. And because it happened on a Sunday evening, by the time we got to school on the Monday morning, the vast majority of students were aware of this horror that had happened via social media, but lots of staff weren't. And so we were really in a position where we were shocked and saddened and feeling numb, but we had to respond really quickly with little time to do that. Looking back on it now, there were some things we did exceptionally well, things like supporting the family and her friends and all those sorts of things. But there were things that we didn't do in a timely enough fashion because we'd never had imagined this scenario and sort of played out what would happen. So I would suggest to you it's a really good idea. And even if you have a bereavement policy currently, take it out and have a look at it, because we're suddenly going to be in a position where every single school is going to be affected in some way, shape or form by bereavement and loss. And it might be the death of adult within your school setting. It might be a pupil in your school setting. But it is very likely that even if it's not directly a loss that impacts on the school, lots of people in your institution will have been affected indirectly. So it's really important that you start to think about that. So when we send out this presentation to you, there are a number of other resources we're offering to you. Now, if you're a new start school, the chances are you will already have had these, but you'll be getting them again anyway. And one of the documents we prepared was an audit to help you think about this process. We also have attached to that some exemplar policies. There's a populated one from a rugby school, which we thought was pretty good. There's a template from the Key, and I know a lot of you rely upon the Key for your policies. There's also a template from the Child Bereavement UK, and that's an organisation that we've used a lot of their resources for this process. So just to give you an idea, if you haven't already got a policy, it might be a good starting point there. But we've also got a preparedness checklist. So the second bullet point here suggests that you identify key people in your organisation. It takes you through that checklist, the kinds of things that you will have to do. So for example, deciding who's going to take overall charge. It may well be your head teacher, but it may well be somebody else in your school. Delegate substitutes if they're unavailable or they're absent, because again, we don't want the process stalling. Decide who in your school community will be responsible for communicating directly with the families involved, and then who will give the news to the rest of the school community. It's really important to play to the strengths of your team. You will know who has which skill sets. You'll want someone to support staff, for example, who've been bereaved. And thinking about the team I worked with, my deputy head was very adept at writing very supportive, informative letters. So I would have asked him to take on that role to make sure that the school community were kept informed. Thank you, Anna. This won't happen to everybody, but particularly with a critical incident, you can get press involvement. And having been there myself, I know it's quite difficult because you don't want to speak to somebody on the phone, but you need to be prepared. So again, decide who will liaise with the journalist. You do not want a member of staff making an unguarded comment, which might then appear online or in a newspaper or whatever. And it's easy to do when someone asks you for a reaction to a situation. So be prepared and think about who is best placed to do that and who will do it effectively. You may wish to organise training for all involved. So another thing that we'll attach to this PowerPoint is a shorter version of this training that would be appropriate for you to utilise, should you wish to do so, with all of your staff or with a smaller group of staff who you know are going to be directly affected and part of this process. So that's there should you wish to use it. And again, as well as the policies I've already referred to, in the Child Bereavement UK document, which we'll show you at the end, there's one for a primary school on page 69 and one for a secondary school on page 78. And we really think they're very good in the way that they've set out that process. Thank you, Anna. As I mentioned to you already, one of our difficulties in dealing with that situation is that it was communicated really quickly on social media. And that's a time before social media really took off. So I can only imagine how that would appear now. But if you are in a situation where there's social media involved, if you have platforms in your school, it's crucial that before you share any information on your school platforms, that you get permission for the family who's impacted directly, who's involved in this. You should not be doing it without involving them. Now, schools cannot contain information that's shared within the community. It will leak out. So it's probably quite important that you do make a statement at some stage to show that you're reacting to this situation. So communication with the whole school community is really quite important, with as much information as you're able to give. So as I said, you know, getting permission from the family members, but also language that's appropriate for your audience. So it might be something you want to send to students, parents, governing body, whoever it may be. So obviously what you're trying to do is to reduce anxiety, give appropriate levels of information, and stop the spread of rumours. So think about, again, who's best placed in your team to communicate with the whole school community. And don't forget key groups like the governing body. Some of your governors won't live in your community, and they may well not be, you know, getting that information from elsewhere. So if you do come back to a high profile situation, the local authority can offer help and guidance on the process and protocol. And likewise, if you're in a MAT, there will no doubt be someone within your organisation that can support you. And it's really important to think about the young person's perspective. So if it's to do with the young person in your school and their family, think about how they are going to view the communication that you put out and the information you share. Thank you, Anna. So if you are in a situation, as many of you will be, when you come back supporting a bereaved child in your school community, think about that child's closest friends. And we would recommend that you think about telling their close friends away from a large group. You know, for them to find out in an assembly is not very appropriate. So try to get them on their own and talk to them about this process. We've already said, try not to judge, irrespective of the circumstances. You do need to check out the facts of what's happened, though, because young people need honesty, and you may well find yourself answering quite awkward questions, but try and be as truthful as you can. And as I said, you know, as truthful as you can and factual as you can as well. So we've mentioned this already, so don't be afraid to use the words dead or death. I'm very sorry to hear about the death of your grandmother, whoever it may be. Be prepared to listen. You need to recognise the full tragedy. And as Anna said, avoid comments like, at least it's not as bad as. You might think it's helpful, but it's not, because it really dismisses their level of grief and their own feelings. Bereaved pupils will need time. We've already said there's no set expiration date for grief, and students will react very differently. It's really important for them to know that you're available to them, and they can come and sit with you. Even if they don't want to talk to you and with you, it just is a very good supportive thing to be around and allow them to come and just sit and be quiet and be around you, if that helps them. Thank you. We all know, because we will have experienced grief in some way, shape or form ourselves, it is very personal and everybody deals with it very differently. You may find a pupil wants to return to school very quickly because that might be appropriate for them. They might want that routine, that degree of normality. There may be others who are off school for a sustained period. At whatever point they come back to you, we would suggest that you put some systems in place. These are just some examples, and I'm sure you've got lots that you could add to this, but time-out cards. So young people often get very embarrassed about showing their emotions. So if you give them a time-out card, it just signals to the teacher, the TA, whoever's in the room with them, they need to step away. And it gives them a chance to express their grief more privately. And they might just suddenly be overwhelmed in a lesson. And it may actually be nothing to do with the lesson itself or to do with anything that someone said to them. But those thoughts can be quite intrusive, can't they? And they could just suddenly be overwhelmed and need to come out of the room. So access to a quiet space is also very useful if you can organise that. And I know some of you do that routinely, but quite often we take students back to pastoral offices. And the very nature of those offices is that they're very noisy. There's lots of people coming and going, phones going, etc., etc. And some students will be overwhelmed by that. So if you have a space in your school where a student can go to if they just want to reflect and be quiet on their own, that is great. Now, you may eventually need more intensive support from identified members of staff. And again, it's a really good idea to think that through. Who's best placed in your organisation to offer that support? And then ultimately, Anna's going to talk about when we might need to access specialist support, but you'll need to know what's available out there, what you have in your locality, what there is in Birmingham as a whole, because you may need to access some of those specialist support services for certain individuals in your school. Thank you. Now, as I said, some of you now will be in a situation where you're getting more and more students coming into school, but we do know there are some schools where, for lots of reasons, students have not yet returned to school. So you may be in a situation where you're supporting their grief remotely. And these are some suggestions from Beyond the Horizon. So they're suggesting, obviously, that you stay in regular contact with a bereaved child. So once you are made aware of a bereavement, and it may be through a family member, maybe through the student themselves or through their friends, try to maintain regular contact. They suggest that you appoint 1 or 2 people to liaise with the child. And the reason they suggest that sometimes it should be 2 is that you could become overwhelmed yourself by this, and you may want support. And it's often useful to have 2 people alongside each other, if that is possible. Now, if you've got a team that supports students during bereavement, it may be them, it might be teachers that they're close to, it may be their form tutors. So whoever you feel is most appropriate to that individual, then give them that role, so that we don't all leave it to everybody else. So they actually know it's part of their remit to make contact with that young person. So schedule regular points of contact during the week. So don't just leave it, well, I'll speak to you at some stage. Try to give them some routine, and it will be whatever mode of communication is approved by your schools. So you might want to phone, you might want to email. Well, I think I would suggest more than emailing, but you may use Teams, you may use Zoom, you may use Google Classrooms. Whatever you think is appropriate to your school that you're currently using, utilise that mode of communication. And it's really important to provide a space for that young person's friends to share their grief and condolences. You might do that by emails and messages, but you could also, if your school allows, set up a virtual meeting so that they can see each other and express their own condolences and offer that friend support. But really important that the students know that they can come to you for support. So you might have your scheduled meetup, but it's good for them to know they can contact you in school hours at other times should they need that support. Thank you. Oh, I think this is you now, Anna, isn't it?
Thanks, Mandy. So just thinking about that then, I think we've alluded to this a few times really, about the fact that grief isn't sort of time limited, as it were. And I think, you know, having looked at some videos from Bereavement UK about young people talking about their experiences of going back to school after a significant bereavement, for example, is how sometimes, you know, schools just imagine just a few months and, you know, let's just put that to one side. Yeah, it's all done and dusted now. Let's move on, and, you know, and it's all sorted. That was a few months ago. And I think, you know, we just need to be really aware that the grief will continue for a long period of time, and it can pop up at the most inconvenient times. You know, I know Anna and Mandy have heard me talk about this before, but when my parents separated when I was in my early 20s, I remember just getting really upset and crying over a tablecloth. Which is the most innocuous thing that you could ever imagine, but actually it was a wedding present, and it kind of just, you know, it was just what triggered me off thinking, you know, that this was the end of a relationship. And so, you know, it can crop up at the most inconvenient time, and in school, you know, that could be walking down to assembly, that could be, you know, you're just about to do something absolutely brilliant, you've organised, and, you know, the grief is there and it's just popped up. So just bear that in mind, that we need to be then prepared to listen again and again and again. And I think, you know, as I said to you, it isn't something that just will just disappear and go away. You know, on its own, we need to be there, ready to be listening. Giving it time, as I said, before they can fully cope with the pressures of work. And I think, you know, we're all from education. We appreciate the difficulties and the challenges that come with data and needing to get children to progress. But obviously, if they're grieving and they're in a whole different headspace, then we're not going to get that. And it can be a while before children can fully cope with the school pressures of work. I know that we've spoken to young people before just in the last few years, and you know, I think, and there was one young person who said that they had a parent had passed away a year ago, and he was sat in a lesson, and he just sort of suddenly felt overwhelmed with grief and wanted to leave the lesson and just get some space. but actually then felt that he couldn't, and so started to misbehave to make sure that he could get kicked out of the lesson so that he could go and get some space. So just bear in mind, as Mandy said, that, you know, those processes and systems that we might have in the short term, we just got to be mindful of them sort of long term. And this was a young man that was sort of a year down the line of having lost a parent. Be aware of important dates, and I think often this will be, you know, perhaps a birthday of someone significant that have lost, or if, you know, if it's a separation, there may be a significant day or something similar. Just being aware of those dates, because sometimes those days can just pass quite easily, but the days after that can be hard. If it was me, I'd put a note on your CPOMs or my concern, or some way of just recording a date where there's that been significant, to perhaps chat to the young person about how they might want to remember that day, if at all. For some children, they just want that day to be normal and they come into school and it's all fine, and for other children and young people, they would like to have it recognised, and the school can help with that. So again, just being mindful of that. And I think we need to be aware, therefore, when we think about Father's Day and Mother's Day, those can be very significant days, and particularly in primary, they're things that we would sort of do activities on. And I think we've got to be very mindful, particularly when we realise the data around children and young people, and how many children and young people have lost a significant person in their life, that actually those dates cannot be helpful sometimes if we're doing a big celebration about Father's and Mother's Day. So Winston's Wish, if you go onto their website, they've got some great ideas of how to remember Father's Day or Mother's Day for those who have lost a parent. And then finally, it's kind of just knowing what to do, perhaps if there's been like perhaps a bereavement, so we've lost a child within a class, or even if there's been a member of staff who's passed away. It's actually, what those kind of feelings get stirred up when we see that empty desk, when we see where they used to sit in the staff room or their mug or whatever it was. And it's almost like sort of negotiating with the people around them and within that class or within the staff room about how we sort of remember that empty space for a while, and what that might mean and stir up for people. So it's just being mindful of how people might feel as part of that grief process, and it's very, very different for everybody, of course. Thanks, Anna. So these slides have really come from our friends again at Beyond the Horizon, because it was just really helpful, I think, to know, as Anna said right at the beginning, most children, when they've gone through a bereavement or a loss, will be able to assimilate that. They will be able to cope, they will have support from yourselves, from family, and they will have sort of, been able to get through and manage without support. But of course, it's fine as well if children and young people and adults need support beyond that, that's fine too. But we thought it'd be helpful for you to know when to contact a specialist, when might be the best time. Do we say, actually, this is more than what we can be able to help this person with, and we think we need their further support. So just in that slide, we've got Edgeworths Trust, we've got Cruise, we've got Beyond the Horizon, and of course we've got STB, we've got Forward Thinking Birmingham, who are some really great, helpful organisations in Birmingham that will be able to help you. And we'll give you some more details about that later on. So if there has been an extended period of disrupted relationships within the family and within friends, then it might be worth thinking about contacting a specialist for support. If there has been an inability of the parent to be able to meet a child's needs, so perhaps that parent is within their own grief and they're not able to then meet that child's needs and help them through the grief, then it might be best to contact someone for extra support. A prolonged lack of interest in activities that they used to be involved in. I think this word prolonged is an interesting one, and it certainly came up in the last training that we did. So I'm actually going to drop on Anna really just to sort of share, because I think she explains beautifully what that prolonged time, because it comes up on a couple of the slides, what we might mean by that. Is that all right, Anna? What does that mean?
You say that and now I won't be able to remember what I've said before. I guess, so there is often what people want in the world of kind of mental health and well-being is they want certainty. So what does prolonged mean? And actually, you know, when we know children, when we know families, when we know their circumstance, we know kind of intuitively what is prolonged. So, you know, it is quite normal to have a period of time where one feels low, one feels sad, etc., etc. Where that starts to interrupt functioning in everyday life is where one would start to be concerned. So when kind of they start to really withdraw from things, to retreat, or where we see behaviours that are, you know, really uncommon for a longer period of time, excuse me, or they start to become entrenched, then that's when we would start to think about, actually, we need some more support here. So, you know, some of it comes down to intuition, as much as needing a set time scale. So for some people that might be sooner than others. Does that make sense, Anna? Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Prolonged refusal to attend school or poor academic performance, and as I said, as Anna said, it's really a sort of a judgment call on knowing that child, that young person, as to what prolonged means and what's presenting. Continued problems with sleeping, persistence of low confidence, feeling of shame or guilt, and then a prolonged fear of being alone. I had a friend who had separated from her partner and her 3 children. One of them was really afraid of being upstairs when they'd gone to bed, and mum was downstairs. And, you know, so just even things like that, it's just that fear of being alone, even if there are adults in the house, for example. But if that's prolonged, and as Anna said, it's become entrenched, and it's actually very difficult for them to get themselves out of that. Signs of chronic depression, risk-taking behaviour. So, for example, the drug or alcohol abuse, sexual experimentation, fighting, reckless driving. So we're starting to see that behaviour coming out as a consequence of the grief that they're feeling. Repeated desires to join the dead person, or copying the symptoms and behaviours of the deceased, or repeatedly dreaming of their own death. That would need some specialist support to help that person. They're convinced that they've caused the harm or death, and that goes back to where Anna was talking about that develops particularly for younger children. They can be convinced that they've caused that, but that could happen for any child and adult indeed. The death of their parent or sibling was by suicide. It would be best to contact specialist support to help them through that. And they were directly or indirectly responsible for the death of the person. And again, that would be the time to contact specialist support. So just thinking then about the links to PSHE, and we said, didn't we, that school is a great space to be able to help children and young people. And as we know, I think it was 70% of children have experienced some kind of loss. And indeed, when we do some work through the New Start project, and we do screening in both primary and secondary school, and we ask all children about the things that they worry about. And particularly the first one is work related, it's to do with school and their work. But interestingly, the second one is about their worries about losing a loved one, so losing a parent, a grandparent, or even a pet. So that anxiety is already sort of there, whether they've lost that or not. And so actually being able to put that into PSHE in primary and secondary, to be able to almost give children the language around what it is to lose someone, and to be able to feel like they can talk to someone and to be able to process that is quite helpful. And PSHE is one of the ways in which we might be able to do that. And we know that there are elements of that are going to become statutory from September anyway. But these are the key areas that we've pulled out of the PSHE curriculum about how to talk about our emotions, to recognise those early signs of mental health and wellbeing concerns, and particularly in secondary, being able to know the types of mental ill health that we may experience. So being able to sort of use books and stories are really helpful as well. And Bereavement UK has done an absolutely brilliant document that Mandy's going to talk about a bit later on. But in there are some really lovely examples of books and stories that can be used in school to just talk about loss and bereavement in a sort of just a normalised way, I guess. So, for example, Badger's Parting Gift is a beautiful book from a primary that could be used in Key Stage 2. And it talks about Badger and how he's dying and how his friends deal with that grief, and they look at that together. But of course, we do need to bear in mind, if we are going to do lessons on loss or bereavement in that way, we need to be mindful of who's in the room, and talking to children and young people that we know who will have experienced that beforehand, and to let them know that they can leave the room or talk about it, that this is what we'll be talking about. So obviously, again, it's just being mindful, if you are going to use those stories and books, to think about the children, the young people that you've got in your class, your room, and how they may be affected and what they can do to help themselves when we're talking about it.
Thank you.
Okay.
And as part of this process, it's really important that you look after yourselves as members of staff. I think we will do that instinctively if we're dealing with a loss of the death of a member of staff, for example, but we have to also think about the impact it has on us if we're offering support to others. It can be absolutely exhausting, and so you need to take care of yourself as well. One of the things that staff need to understand is that you don't have to be an expert to be able to offer effective help. And particularly if a student seeks you out, they are seeking you out because of the quality of the relationship they have with you, and they know that you will support them and listen to them. So it's important that if you're chosen by a young person, then you've already got the basis of a relationship there. Staff need to be able to share their feelings. And as Anna said, if you have had the situation where a member of staff has died during this period, there will be a place they used to sit in the staff room, a mug they used to use. But again, there will be feelings about young people who've had losses. It might be in their wider families, it might be in their wider communities. So encourage staff to talk about how they feel as well. And as Anna's tablecloth example, you know, you may experience an emotional reaction yourself, and it may be something really strange that triggers it that you're not expecting. So give yourself a break. You can help as much as you can, but don't expect too much from yourself, and be prepared to say, I need to walk away now for a little while. I need to go and have some space myself, because it's really important that you take care of yourself. If you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to offer effective help. One of the things you could do is to get some of these resources in your staff room, in your staff library, so that staff themselves have access to them. They know which organisations they can contact. They know which resources might be of use to them, because, you know, there's no point in that information just sitting with one or two people if there are lots of people involved in this process. Thank you, Anna. Do you want to talk about this one? Because it will have moved on since we did this slide, obviously, won't it?
Yeah, so the NHS, so what's called the clinical commissioning group, so the people who kind of purchase NHS services, have set up a bereavement support line. There is also an email address that goes with this. So when you get sent your resources, you will be sent a link to a Google Drive, which has a whole host of images and things on it, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. But when we first went live, there was only a phone number. So it's a group of bereavement organisations. So Crews, Beyond the Horizon, Edwards Trust, a couple of the hospices across Birmingham and Solihull, who've set up a single point of access. So this is for young people, for parents, for teachers, so for anybody to be able to access to then find further support. So when you, as I say, when you get your resources in there should be a link to a Google Drive, which is one that the NHS have set up. And on there, you will be able to get into all the resources, and you can pull out the images and things that will speak most to your populations that you're working with.
Thank you. We've already mentioned this Managing Bereavement, a Guide for Schools by the Child Bereavement UK. This is actually the first document we utilised when we were creating this training, when we used to do it face-to-face. It really is exceptional. It's really user-friendly. There's lots of advice, etc. for you to utilise. So there'll be a link to that document. And in addition, you should be aware of the services and training that the Birmingham Ed Psych Services is currently offering. So via the Birmingham Education Bulletin, we've shared things like webinars that they've produced for parents and for educational professionals, and they really are very useful. If you have a chance to access those, please do so. But as well as that, the Ed Psych Service offers response to critical incidents. So your designated EP should be offering some support time to your school via your head. So that will come in via that route, but hopefully you'll all benefit from that level of support. And it's bespoke to you. So depending on the circumstances you find yourselves in, they will signpost things and offer support and training, etc. So please be aware of that, and hopefully you'll be able to access that yourselves. Thank you, Anna. I really do hope by now you've heard about COOTH, because the Birmingham City Council has commissioned this for our city. It's a safe, confidential and anonymous way to access emotional wellbeing and mental health support for young people between the ages of 11 and 25. It had already been widely used across the country, and it was well rated, but we have to say that in the couple of months that it's been active in Birmingham, the levels of engagement have been extremely high, and we're beginning to get very useful data back now, which will allow us to target support and help to different communities. One thing that we'd say about COOTH is that it seems to have been well accessed by males, which is often not the case with these sorts of online confidential helplines, but also by the BAME community as well. So it's a very varied platform. There are forums on there, there are lots of resources on there. Young people can get access to one-to-one counselling should they need that. So there's lots of different things on there. Some may just want to go and look, some may want to go and contribute. But one thing that you need to know is if there is contributions, they're all moderated. So although the chat appears to be live, it isn't. So they look at what's being said there, and they will safeguard the young people who are on that platform. So it's absolutely free to you as Birmingham schools. So if you've not yet been able to advertise that to your young people, please do so. And some of you who are in primary schools may well find that your parents fit in that age group. So, you know, you can advertise it to parents as well if you think that's appropriate, because it's literally for everybody and it is anonymous. So it's widely used. And we think we've been very impressed so far by the sorts of feedback that we've had. And there may well be students in your school who are all already accessing that platform. Thank you. So in terms of organisations, you can see we've put links to various charities and useful organisations. But again, in our pack, because there are literally so many hundreds of resources you can be accessing, we've done a resource sheet for you. And the idea is we've looked at several of these organisations, and we've picked out an example of a resource that they offer, in the hope that you look at that and think, well, that would suit our cohort, it's not what we need or whatever, and then you can access more of them should you wish to do so. And there's just a few I'd like to draw your attention to. So on the Child Bereavement Network, and you'll see this, there's a separate list of resources that we've created for you. There are 4 cards, and we've been talking all the way through about the way that different people grieve. These cards are populated with lots of strategies. So as an example, there might be an idea to start a memory box. A young person may need help with schoolwork. There's lots of strategies on these cards. And the young person has 4 of them. They have one for themselves. They look at these strategies and think, what would really help me? What would I respond positively to? They can give one to their teacher, whoever their lead teacher may be. There's one for friends, and there's also one for parents. So rather than just thinking, you know, we're going to do the same with everybody, allow them to look at these sorts of ideas and decide what they think would be most suitable for them. So that's one resource that's on there. On the ELSA site, which isn't here, but it definitely is on our list of resources, there's lots of primary type resources. So, for example, there's a support network tree where young people can populate it with looking at who they feel would offer them support. They also provide things like conversation starters. So there's prompt sheets to help you. So there's one that's entitled When a Grandparent Dies. So just the idea of you thinking about it before you start this conversation about what that child might want to talk to you about, and it just helps you to imagine the scenario. Not that you're, you know, it's not a role play for you to learn off verbatim, but it certainly might be some prompts that you feel will enhance your confidence. And the one that I always keep forgetting to talk about, which is great, there's also a link on there to a news round clip. And obviously the target audience is young teenagers. And it's Dr. Tina Ray talking about the concept of death and loss during COVID-19. So it's an excellent piece. You could use it as a discussion piece. You might want to, you know, use it as part of your form time, all those kinds of things. But please go and have a look at those, because there are literally so many hundreds of resources. We just wanted to give you a start, a leg up to looking at all of these. But there are lots of others that I'm sure are equally as good. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Mandy. So yeah, I mean, I guess we've finished with the main thrust of the presentation, and we said we'd have some time for questions at the end. So I'm also aware that some of you will probably need to go off to, you know, go and find classes and things like that. So I'll say now, thank you to everybody for joining us. Do indulge yourselves in some self-care later on today, if you're able to, and go well into the summer holidays. We've got our next year's mental health short series that we lead as BEP, some of which I think are already available to be booked at on the events page of our website, where you'll have booked onto this. I think the other date should be going up live imminently. But just to say, if you know, the kind of our mental health short series will continue next year via online and also in person, all being well. So if people do have questions, then feel free to either pop them in the chat box. We'll also hang around for a few minutes just afterwards if people want to stay on to ask anything specific. But if you want to go, you are most welcome to go. But if you'd like to stay and ask questions, then we're happy to take some for a few minutes if people want to.